welcome, friends, once again to Booked, our special show on books here on India Today, where we track some of the books every week that really are creating quite a buzz. And one of those books that Siddharth Zarabi, my colleague and editor of Business Today, is joining me to discuss is a very special one. A Sixth of Humanity, Independent India's Development Odyssey, written by two of the sharpest thinkers, Arvind Subramanian, former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, and by Devesh Kapur, one of India's leading political scientists based now in Washington. I appreciate both of you taking the time off to discuss what I can only describe as a magisterial work, which is really encapsulates much of what has happened in India and its economic history and its impact on development over the last 75 years. So thank you both very much for doing this and appreciate you joining us. I want to say at the very outset, I want to understand, I've heard of jugalbandis in the world of music. You hear of partnerships in the world of cricket. But how does that happen when it comes to books? Two fine minds like you coming together. Mr. Subramanian, you want to start first and tell us where the idea came of coming together and bringing together a book like this?
First of all, I think, as jugalbandis goes, writing a joint book is always a fraught exercise. And I want to say that after 5 and 10 years, Devesh are still as good friends as when we embarked on this project. This project has been simmering and brewing for a long time. We actually have written it in over 5 years, but we've been thinking about it for much longer. Both Devesh and I have independently worked on India quite a bit. We've been discussing these ideas for a long time now. And about, I would say, 7, 8 years ago, we said, there's some things which we agreed on, like this whole concept of India as a precocious democracy. Does it have legs? Devesh has done some excellent work on India's public institutions. I've done some work on India's growth. Devesh has written on, Indian society and nation building. So from that background, it's not difficult then to see that the framework that we've adopted for the book is really thinking about development in a very broad context.
I just want a word that you pick up on, a word that Dr. Subramanian just raised with you, Professor Kapur, which is precocious democracy. Because that word keeps cropping up at various stages in the book. Explain what you mean by India being seen as a precocious democracy, that word that you've used in the book.
So the way we think of the word precocious is something that is before its time, right? So when we think of a young person, we say she is precocious, we think, my God, compared to her age, she's so, mature, smart, things like that. So we use the word precocious democracy in the sense that when India gave universal franchise, it gave it to its people at a level of development that was completely sort of exceptional. If we see the classic Western story, the extension of the franchise went hand in hand with gradual economic development. If we see the successful East Asian countries, the franchise came after they had achieved a level of development. If we see the biggest sort of successful story right now, China, well, there is no franchise. So India was really an outlier in the decision to give universal franchise despite such enormously large rates of illiteracy, primarily a rural population, very low levels of income, and a very weak sort of bourgeoisie. So that's the sense in which we use the word precocious.
So Rajdeep, can I
Yes.
Sorry, can I just, yeah.
Yeah, sure. It's a free-flowing conversation. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I want to, and maybe Siddharth, if I've preempted you, my apologies. See,
No.
I think that although we began with the idea of precociousness as applying to politics and democracy, it is a theme that runs much wider in the book. Let me give you one example, which maybe Siddharth will be more familiar with, is that take economics, for example. Most successful countries, when they develop, they do agriculture first, then manufacturing, and then services. In India, for example, has pretty much done very little manufacturing. For example, organized sector employment in manufacturing has been very low, like less than 10% compared to a Korea or a Taiwan or a China that at its peak had 35% of its labor force in manufacturing. So that's another sense in which India was precocious in doing services well before other countries did it at a comparable point, to the neglect of manufacturing. Similarly, on the trade side, most countries, what they do is they export labor-intensive goods. And then they, as they develop, they export more high skill intensive goods, and then they export services. India has completely reversed that, but with a twist. It's not in trade, but the Indian twist is that we have been exporting high skilled talent largely via migration. So in a sense, we've been exporting talent, and we have not exported enough low skill manufacturing. So that's another sense in which, from an economic and trade point of view, we've been precocious as well.
That's a very good point. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Kapur.
No. So just, we see the same pattern in education, right? We did not do basic literacy for all before we developed elite higher education institutions. And in fact, today, the gross enrollment ratio in higher education, India is a complete outlier in how high it is relative to its per capita income. Most Western countries achieve this gross enrollment ratio, which India is so proud of, at incomes that were 4 to 5 times greater than India's.
So just, last point, continuing the Jugalbandi, I hope you don't mind.
No, we are enjoying it. We're listening.
Yeah. So that's why we mean precociousness in the sense of democracy before development, manufacturing and services and high skill activities before, but also in terms of policy choices, which were very irregular and very different from what was done elsewhere in the world. So Devesh spoke about secondary education and before primary education, for example. Another big and very consequential manifestation is that India, because of democracy, the need to redistribute, it embarked and prioritized redistribution by the government over providing public goods like infrastructure, basic education, basic health. So precociousness is a theme of the book in a much broader connotation than just applying to politics or even economics.
There's so much to unpack there, particularly the last point, and the most recent state elections perhaps can further that point that you just made, Dr. Subramanian. But I want to come to one of the central themes that I picked up from the book, and it also is related to the answer that you've just given. The point that you make is that India's structural transformation, according to you, is incomplete, or we could say it's still work in progress. What, according to you, for the benefit of our viewers, is the missing piece as of today? And also, who do you think really dropped the ball?
Yeah, there are 2 or 3 questions in there. I think let me reverse the answer by saying who dropped the ball, right? I think there is no doubt that in the first 30 years, because of the policies we followed, I mean, even the question of structural transformation did not arise because, due to a number of policy decisions that we took, closing ourselves from trade, stifling the domestic private sector, not investing enough in agriculture, not investing in primary education. We had a situation of very low growth and very little structural transformation, in the sense that manufacturing was very small, employment in manufacturing was very small. So the interesting question then becomes, and so we dropped the ball. So that's the answer to the first question. But then the interesting question arises after 1980 and especially after 1990, when in fact we had a lot of dynamism. Between 1980 and about 2015, we were amongst the top 7 or 8 fastest growing countries in the world. So the puzzle is, why in that period did we not get the structural transformation? So that's the puzzle, not why we didn't get it in the first 30 years, because the question didn't arise. We just, stymied all kinds of economic activity. So the question is why. And if you want me to go into it, I can elaborate on that. But essentially that I would say that, there are kind of 3 or 4, by no outcome can ever be explained by a single cause or factor. But I think there was a series of things that happened. First of all, what we show in the book is that the kind of agricultural transformation, agricultural productivity transformation that happened in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China, that increase in agricultural productivity at that scale and pace did not happen in India. So we were never able to produce the kind of incomes and surpluses that would then create demand for labor-intensive manufacturing in India. So that was kind of the first deficiency, as it were. Then, of course, we have this whole panoply of regulations, and there are multiple dimensions to the regulation. But the one that we pick up on in the book is what we call midgets making widgets. Essentially that, manufacturing, something about our policy that prevented firms from becoming big. Too often the question we say, oh, our labor laws make firms remain small. But the big puzzle is, it's not that we haven't had big firms. We do have reasonably big firms, but we don't have enough of them, and we don't have them of even bigger size. So a whole bunch of regulations in India have prevented that. That's the kind of the second. I'll touch upon one more, and then maybe Devesh can add in. I think one of the maybe the new ideas in the book that we have to explain the structural transformation is what we call Dutch disease. Dutch disease is, when one sector does well, it was oil, another sector, manufacturing, gets affected by that. Right. So in India, there were 2 sectors actually that dampened the impact on manufacturing. One is when the services sector started doing very well, it did have an impact on manufacturing. The second, I think, maybe as important, is the government in India is a very big employer. Now, why does it affect manufacturing? It affects manufacturing in 2 ways. Firstly, wages at the lower end of the spectrum in manufacturing are related to government wages. The government is the competing option. And wages in the government sector are very, very high, especially at the lower end, so that the kind of supply to manufacturing of low-skilled labor is affected by that. The other thing, of course, is that, this is something that Devesh has documented elsewhere, that if you look at India, how many people write the exam for the civil services and, they stay out of the labor force, for a long time. And therefore, again, the labor supply to manufacturing is affected. So to cut a long story short, there's this very subtle Dutch disease effect, which comes from both services and the government sector, making both manufacturing unprofitable and also not desirable as employment opportunities.
But just to pick up on what you say, you call it a Dutch disease, but Devesh Kapur, and you've worked on this, the politics of this country is such that today, for example, if you want to bring in the kind of agricultural reform, the farm laws, if you wanted to bring in the kind of labor reform, there are political barriers. We are in that sense not China. You can get away in China because an authoritarian society means they will brook no dissent. In India, there are competing interest groups, and navigating them is easier said than done. In the book also you reflect upon it, upon in a way the challenges of democracy on one side and development or faster development on the other. Do you concede therefore that makes India's task that much more difficult? Because of our democratic spirit, you have to be far more accommodative and therefore perhaps not take those big ticket decisions that you otherwise would if you were, let's say, one of the East Asian more autocratic or semi-autocratic countries.
And Rajdeep, just to slip in one word, diversity to add to the point that you made.
Sure, and we'll build on the diversity point in a moment, but go ahead.
No, so look, it's certainly the case that democracy makes reforms harder, especially in a country with so many parties, so many interest groups, etc. But I do think that some of these policies have been self-inflicted without necessarily ground pressure from potential voters. So take an example, when Arvind talked about structural transformation, one feature of structural transformation is that a largely rural society becomes gradually more and more urban, right? But the way urbanization in India has been thwarted, and even if you see the 74th Amendment, which tried to amend things, we know that most of the states have basically completely sabotaged it, right? And we know that, in fact, 100 years ago, in 1918, so Dr. Ambedkar wrote a really interesting paper where he argued that to save the Indian farmer, we have to get many of them out of farming. Because the idea is that most farm plots are so small that you simply cannot get a viable income from them. However, instead of trying to do that, we've tried to do all sorts of subsidies to keep them on the farm. So remember, we don't have any scheme to give construction workers 2,000 rupees every few months. But somehow we feel we have to give it to farmers. Now, why do we think that construction workers are less deserving? That's a pure policy choice. There was no pressure from farmers to give 2,000 rupees a month. That was basically a way in which, politicians thought this is a way to get more votes. So in some ways, much of this, what we blame democracy and voters, is really ideological choices, the lack of imagination. All of these also play a part.
No, but if I can push you there, because we've just had an election in Bihar, where there was some level of criticism, perhaps not enough, of the manner in which just before an election, the government suddenly announces we are giving 10,000 rupees to 1.5 crore women. And there is a belief that these cash handouts will now be the precedent. They've already become so. What they're called freebies, Revdi, call it what, across the country. They win you votes. The point is that if you are in a vote-driven economy and polity and elections are taking place every few months, how do you then achieve some of those structural transformations that you can when you know that the fiscal debt of several of these states is ballooning, in many cases, out of control?
Rajdeep,
just finish a short thing. Which is...
Yeah, go ahead, Devesh, and then Arvind, whichever way.
Okay, so now that you've had the elections in Bihar, they have a large majority. They have basically 5 years. The question is, why can't Bihar now attract manufacturing the way Tamil Nadu has? Tamil Nadu faces the same problems of elections. Yes, of course it affects them. But we know they've been able to attract sort of labor-intensive manufacturing, and Apple being a very good example. But You don't see a drive in Bihar. Okay, now that the elections are behind, one way or the other, we won. Now, how do we really get manufacturing of different types to come into the state? Because I have a 5 year runway. At least I have not seen anything.
That's the point, Siddharth, you
So,
make of diversity, because one of the interesting chapters in the book is when you catalog states and look at there are states in India, peninsular India, on the west coast of India, which can compete perhaps with even some of the faster growing economies of the world. But then you look at the states like Bihar, which are lagging behind, and the fear is the gap is only widening. In
yeah.
terms of per capita income, GDP, 4-5 times is the difference between some of the states of southern India and the states of northern India. But the northern India states is where political power resides. They have the MPs. How do you resolve these paradoxes? And do you believe that this diversity dividend that we talk about is something that India is a strength, or is it a weakness because it's leading to severe regional inequalities?
So Rajdeep, if I may, see a couple of things, right? One is one of the things we show in the book, which kind of speaks to what you're saying, is that 1/3 of India grew almost as rapidly as China and for as long. So India has at least mini Chinas, which should be, a source of hope. Now, how does that become a source of hope? Obviously, the other states have to catch up. I think there are, a couple of ways in which this can happen, right? One is the logic of competitive federalism. That in the old days, right, nobody was doing well. We were doing uniformly poorly. So we could throw back our hands and say, oh, India is not capable of it. But now, if some states do well, then that is both a pressure and a model on other states to compete. Otherwise, you're going to get left behind. Now, that hasn't happened to the extent that it should, but it is happening. I mean, go back to the old West Bengal example when the Tata Nano factory was, going to be located, but, there were riots. But then Gujarat came forward and offered an alternative opportunity. So similarly, I think there is the dynamic now that no longer can people say, oh my God, India can't do it because next door someone is doing it. But I want to come back to your other point about, is democracy responsible, right? There is no doubt that one of the things that's happened in India now, and we have a statistic in the book which says in 1952, the average gap between elections was almost 5 years. Today, the average gap between elections is about 1.2 years, so that this competitive populism and democracy is a problem. But here's where I would push back on this notion of democracy, right? One is what Devesh said. I know clearly we can have better political imagination, but let me give you the following example. Take electricity subsidies given in India for electricity. Manufacturing pays twice the cost of electricity that it ought to. Why does it happen? Because we subsidize households. Now, think about it. If these households were going to poor people, you would say, well, democracy, socialism, warrants that. But 60 to 70% of the subsidies go to 5 to 10% of the population. That is neither socialism nor democracy that's giving you that. So these are just, I think, bad policy choices, unimaginative policy choices that some states are breaking out of, and that should be the provocation and the trigger for other states also to follow suit.
That brings me to my next question. And again, drawing from this book and in the context of what we have been speaking about, and many of our viewers will perhaps wonder whether it's just the politics of the country that is to blame. But you make this point that we've also been held back because of lack of administrative capacity and not really ideology. Are you therefore saying that it's the bureaucracy that is responsible and not just the politicians for slowing the pace of India's rise?
Look, for sure, something as complex as this, we should be careful about pinning the blame on one single actor, right? For instance, you didn't mention, but we know, around the world, when we look at R&D expenditures, the private sector is the largest, right? It's private sector, government, and universities. India, the private sector is the lowest. Now, why does the India's private sector not invest in R&D? That's not because of politics, right? It's a choice because they feel they can make rents otherwise and don't have to innovate. They don't want competition. That's why we see some of our largest industrial groups, our largest business houses, in non-competitive, non-tradable sectors like infrastructure, where, by definition, competition, there are natural monopolies, competition will be less. So so the blame needs to be spread out more broadly. But coming back to your question of the bureaucracy, see, one of the real puzzles is that, see, most of the actions, if you're a SME, right? Yes, the GOI's policies matter, but your day-to-day life is governed by what is happening at the local level, right? Are you getting electricity at a reasonable price? Uh, is the garbage removed? Are there extortion? Is there a local gang linked to a ruling party that does extortion? You need to get paperwork done, but the bureaucrat you were dealing with gets transferred. Then the new guy needs a few more months to read the files. You know, in many of these cases, we show such high rates of sort of vacancies, right? So transfers, vacancies, these are all choices which we show. And the record is the government of India's own reports have recognized this for 60 years, right? Take something simple, which you would know, like a concern of business, contracts or enforcement, right? Contract enforcement, sometimes you have to go to courts, which is, of course, you're not going to go to the Supreme Court for a contract enforcement. I mean, for most small contracts, right? It's the district court. Why have states so underinvested in district courts despite the massive number of cases that have piled up? These are not
Right,
super expensive things, right?
right.
And they will not invest in the infrastructure, they will not invest in people, even though. So I think these are things where, in a sense, you can blame the bureaucrats if bureaucrats are there in the first place. But in
Right.
many cases,
No,
they just aren't even there.
See,
Dr.
sorry,
Subramaniam,
Siddharth,
you spent time dealing with
Siddharth,
the Indian bureaucracy, Dr. Subramaniam. So that
no,
the same,
sorry.
very same question to you.
Yeah, see, I think one has to be a little bit careful here because the notion that capacity is weak is probably true. But I also think we should not ignore the fact that capacity has improved considerably over time. I mean, for example, the infrastructure build up in India, for example, over the last 20, 30 years, even in Patna in the last 10 years, is something quite remarkable. So, beginning in the late 90s, the quality of infrastructure has improved, and the improvement in state capacity has had something to do with that. The other thing is that while we kind of have concerns about cash transfers having become too, maybe too populist or has gone over the board, we have to recognize that India has built a social welfare state, whether it's Nrega or cash transfers or chulas or, toilets that have, made the lives of ordinary people so much better than they used to be. So I think, and then of course, the way the Indian state has harnessed technology, to deliver some of these things is also very impressive. So the point is that yes, the state still has infirmities. It still stifles economic activity. But considerably improved its capacity in delivering some of the public goods that previously it was not very good at delivering.
But yet you reflect upon, even in the book towards the end, about the concerns of why private investment, for example, one of the paradoxes, why is private investment not taken off in the way it should? And you seem to suggest that one of the concerns, of course, that you have is the need for greater religious harmony. You also reflect upon the fact about the need for less fear of the enforcement agencies, this climate of fear that almost is driving away at times private capital, the Leviathan state, which we just spoke about, which has huge discretionary powers, the weaponization of enforcement agencies. All of these issues, do you believe, are preventing us from really harnessing our full capacities as a country? Yes, there is investment taking place in infrastructure, but the charge there also is made that it's leading to oligarchs in many cases, where a few individual companies are given most of the major contracts. Are these all concerns? Are we now again missing opportunities like we missed in the first 30 years? Arvind, you want to go first?
Yeah, so I think that's a very fair point, Rajdeep. Also written elsewhere that, one of the big challenges of the Indian economy today, and Siddharth, also you've probably written about it, is that, there's a lot of macro stability, there's low inflation, reserves are good, fiscal position broadly okay, so there's macro stability. The banking system is also been cleaned up. Infrastructure and connectivity have improved. And yet the central puzzle of the economy is, why is private investment so weak? And why are jobs not being created on the back of private investment? I think that's kind of the central challenge today. And there, I do think that some of the factors, one way of thinking about this that, I like to think about is that the government has done a lot to increase the returns to private investment, corporate tax cuts, subsidies, etc. But I think where the problem is that the risks of doing business in India are still very high. And the government, especially the way it's weaponized the state, one, the way there's still tax terrorism and this administrative overzealous enforcement, right? The way some groups are favored over other groups, the playing field is not level across all investors. The way that policies keep changing, the way that center-state relations are not as harmonious as they should be. These are all the factors that we touch upon in the end, the kind of institutional deterioration, the weaponization of the state, that although they seem to be affecting India's politics and society, they do have an impact on the conditions for investment as well. And that may be one of the reasons why private investment is also not taking off as it should.
Yes,
Devesh, go ahead.
This is not just about when we think, normally when we say the state, we are really thinking of Delhi, the central government. But a lot of these actions of the lack of rule of law is also at the state level, right? I mean, in principle, why is West Bengal, West Bengal has had 3 chief ministers since 1977. I mean, which state can say it has had so much political stability? And we generally think political, stability is very conducive to business, right? There's less uncertainty, so on and so forth. Yet, we don't see that transformation happening in Bengal, the state that was India's leading state around independence. And that has to do much more with local factors rather than what is Delhi. Because you see, West Bengal, Tamil Nadu, both opposition ruled states. Yet one opposition state seems to have, despite the constraints from the central government, has done undoubtedly much better than the other. Therefore, we'll have to think about factors at the state level as well and not just what happens in Delhi.
Dr. Subramaniam, if we were to take that argument around the states a little ahead and look ahead really, but based out of 1991, post 91, states got more freedom to act, especially on the economic front. The question I have for you is, why is it that this decentralization seems to have worked well for some states and hasn't worked well for many other states?
I mean, in a sense, it's intrinsic to that, right? In the first 30 years, socialism also meant centralization. So the policy levers were centralized, the fiscal levers were centralized. You saw much more fiscal centralization. So it was like, what they would call a tall poppy syndrome. You don't allow tall poppies. There's mediocrity, but there's also uniform mediocrity. Because the agency of states has been taken away. Once you had political decentralization and fiscal decentralization, by definition, you're giving more agency to the states, and some states took that agency and acted very well, and other states, like what Devesh said about West Bengal, didn't act very well. So it was intrinsic to the 91, not just economic and fiscal, but also the political decentralization that actually, in fact, if you see the chart in our book where we show when the states diverged, it's exactly from 1980 and 91. So in a sense, that's intrinsic to decentralizing and giving more agency. Some states use it well, some states use it worse. So now the question for us is, going back to the earlier thing, the states that are not using that agency well, they have agency. Let's be under no illusion. Devesh is right. Although all that I said about the center is true, that still means there's residual agency with all the states. So the question is, why are some not using it? And I feel more and more that the example of the good states has to travel. No longer can you sit back and say, oh my God, it can't be done in India, because it's being done elsewhere next door. And I think you're beginning to see this change even in the Hindi heartland, for example. I think, for example, Uttar Pradesh is showing that, it is building infrastructure. They're thinking of privatizing the discoms. The liquor policy in Uttar Pradesh is maybe amongst the most progressive in India in the way that they've generated tax revenues. So things are beginning to change. So 2/3 of India has to catch up with 1/3 of India using their agency.
Rajdeep, before you ask a question, Dr. Kapur, Rajdeep, look at this. You have Tamil Nadu as one example. You have West Bengal. You can take Punjab, and you can take Gujarat. Look at the last 4 decades and the individual journey. And if you were to look at the present, because Dr. Subramaniam spoke about Uttar Pradesh, look at the prohibition in Bihar and the completely subterranean illegal industry that it has spawned from a revenue collection point of view. So the states is where all our growth actually comes from. And that's where you see the most divergence and politics and bureaucracy impacting state level outcomes.
It's always interesting, Siddharth, because we focus so heavily on the union budget. Every year you have programming, TV programming. We don't focus enough on state budgets. Many of the states are running huge deficits.
And we'll have to look at Bihar now. I think that should be top of our list.
Because Devesh Kapur, you've looked at, in your other research as well, and looked at particularly West Bengal that you just mentioned. Perhaps the scale of political violence there is a huge deterrent. In a state like West Bengal. Do you ever really see a scenario 20, 30 years down the line where some of these 2/3 of India could even dream of catching up with the 1/3? Or is that going to now become, and it will create social tension as well? You're seeing a lot of out-migration from a West Bengal to other states. You're seeing it from Bihar to other states. You give the great example of Kerala in your book, a state which actually has grown on the remittance economy because Keralites migrated out, but they've in a way built the state. So how do you see this? Because there's a sense many believe that this is going to cause a friction, particularly south versus north, west versus east. Do you see this becoming one of the major challenges going forward?
So undoubtedly, if what we've seen last 20 to 25 years continues to the next quarter century, undoubtedly it will have much greater, stresses, especially how the finance commission sort of sees the allocation, horizontal allocations across states, how the delimitation commission comes up with sort of seats, right, allocation because of the democracy. And these are politically difficult questions. They require the central government and states to work together for the common good. Let me just back off on the thing on states. One state that was interesting, which was again poised to be the sort of leader, Karnataka, right? The IT sector was booming, and Bangalore was poised to be a transformative city. But just look at Bangalore's urbanization. you know, it's really, instead of being a real engine, right? There are all sorts of, the amount of resources wasted in traffic jams in a Bangalore, right? And that is just because a city like Bangalore will never be allowed to have an independent governance. The chief ministers in the states of all political parties last 15 years have been, to put it mildly, just of pretty modest quality in their imagination and thinking about these things. So even states, if you don't have political leadership that is forward looking, is always looking to get some small advantage for some petty politics, the fact is it's going to be harder. I think we are seeing, and the data on this I have to be careful is sparse. We are seeing elements of the Kerala story emerging in Bihar and Bengal, but especially Bihar, which is serious migration, but also migration out of the country. As you might know, most migration to the Gulf, Kerala is just 5% now. 50% is from UP and Bihar. And we see workers from Bihar erecting, electric transmission lines in Africa. They are there in Greece. They are there in Korea. The numbers are not that large for a state of whatever 120, 130 million. But, sending your people out who earn more, send back remittances, that was the core of Kerala's, strategy. It was not industrialization. They didn't do much in IT services. Agriculture, of course, was modest. So I think UP, Bihar, we're seeing elements now. How much this happens because you need large numbers, how the money is used when the money comes back in the state, all of those things are something that we can see. We'll have to see. But I think I wouldn't say that necessarily this will get worse, the gap.
You know, as we enter the last segment, I want to look ahead also, but for a moment look behind, because the book starts with the Nehruvian era, and to be honest, everything is blamed on Nehru today. Things that go wrong, even in 21st century India, usually have some kind of blame put on Nehru. You start the book in one of your first chapters saying, India's fraught inheritance after centuries of colonial rule and a bloodied partition meant almost inevitably that the founders of the republic chose state over markets, public over private sector, centralization over decentralization. In hindsight, should we be blaming Jawaharlal Nehru for what happened through the 40s, 50s? In the 50s, for example, India was ahead of China on most social and economic indicators. Do you believe that the blame lies on Nehru, or as you said earlier, that Nehru's vision possibly on democracy in particular was important for the times, and we sometimes don't recognize it enough in 2025, Arvind Subramanian?
Yeah, see, firstly, I think, Rajdeep, one of the important tasks of looking back, one has to be careful about, there are two traps looking back at the past. One, you can romanticize the past and say, wow, everything was great. The other is to commit what's called the condescension of posterity, and to not be sufficiently acknowledging of the circumstances, the challenges, the constraints that led to certain choices being made. So in that sense, the kind of blaming the past, I think, is not a very useful exercise. I think the two important things are we took some choices in the past. Did those choices evolve as we went along? Right? I.e., if there were good choices, did we continue them? If there were bad choices, did we exit from them? Now, one could argue that, in the case of the economy, we exited from those bad choices. First, in the 60s, I think the emphasis on agriculture under C. Subramanian and the Green Revolution happened in response to a crisis. Similarly, in 91, we exited from the bad choices because of the balance of payments crisis that we had. But the question then is, did we learn enough and have we exited enough from some of the bad choices? And that's kind of the open question. I know. So it's not a question of blaming the past. It's a question of whether we've learned from it, learned both from the failures and the successes. So let me give you one example of not learning from our successes. You think of failure as an orphan. Remember, we benefited in the 90s from becoming more open. And that was the period when the Indian economy really boomed. But in 2017, under this government, we kind of reversed course and started becoming more protectionist. So it was as if we forgot that the period when we opened up was the most productive phase. To go even further, the Congress party today, which presided over some of the biggest successes of liberalization and so on, is only focused on redistribution and caste census, etc., instead of saying, wow, we delivered, we expanded the pie, we expanded opportunities. That's going to be part of our agenda going forward. But even they disembrace, repudiate their own successful past.
Let's look ahead. Let's look ahead, because interestingly, Dr. Subramanian pointed out to crises. And in a way, in the last few months or the last year, we've had a crisis set by Trump's tariff wars.
Yes.
And you wonder whether you move away from protectionism towards opening up, as we appear to be, because the world is changing. And maybe the challenge that Trump's tariffs have posed could in a way also change the way we look at protectionism. Certainly not an ideological war anymore, as the Swadeshi Jagaran Manch or a section perhaps of even the old socialists used to look at it. I just want to put this because in your book you say there are 4 big disruptors: geopolitics, technology, demography, and climate change. Do you believe, Devesh Kapur, do you want to explain this to readers or to our viewers as to what you mean? Geopolitics, for example, in a Trumpian world, where many of, America seems to be becoming more and more isolationist. You've got these tariff wars taking place, and the world is sort of being divided along regional alliances. Will that in a way affect or change India, or is it an opportunity out there?
Well, I think there are at least 2 elements of geopolitics that pose, in my mind, are causes for worry for India. One is broadly the international environment has been pretty stable in the past, 75 years, for which the book covers. We didn't take advantage of that the way East Asia did in exports until the 90s. And then when we did, as we show in the book, India's exports really grew very rapidly and were one of the engines of growth. That now, today, that's going to be a more constricted, a more unstable environment, less based on principles, more based on deals and transactions. The second is, I think, aspect of geopolitics. I think we are deluding ourselves when we think we are somehow comparable to China. China has advanced way, way ahead of India. The amount you see in innovation, it is at the frontier now. This is not a country that is borrowing in a way that, frankly, India is just not in the same league. That has huge implications for security, especially because it is also able to finance. And as we saw with Operation Sindoor, it's been able to fund Pakistan and supply it with advanced weapons. So I think this really needs to be a wake up call for India. You cannot do business as usual. You cannot sort of expect these changes will have incremental or marginal values. Of course, you can chug along to some extent, but if you want to be anywhere in a global sort of leadership position, you have to transform, not just twiddle at the margins.
No, but
Since
sorry,
you,
but Rajdeep, one thing I want to say in response to your question. See, there's obviously geopolitics is changing. The US is becoming more isolationist. But there's also the danger of drawing the wrong conclusions and therefore reacting inappropriately. Let me just give you one example, right? The world is turning protectionist, the external environment is less favorable. So everyone is saying, including large sections of India, we must also turn inward and rely on our economy, etc., etc. This whole Atmanirbharta, etc. But I think one has to be careful here. The way to respond to geopolitics is something much more calibrated. There are things which we need to produce and be self-sufficient on, whether it's technology, whether it's, very important goods like medicines, pharmaceuticals. But on the other hand, it is not, does not warrant imposing quality control orders which destroy the competitiveness of our labor skill exports. So just to give you one example, the world is, less open. But remember, we account still for 3% of global market share in labor intensive goods. There's no reason why that cannot become 10, 12%. So one should not knee-jerk turn away from being open just because the world is becoming a different and a more isolated place. While we need to transform, our responses need to be calibrated to what the opportunities and challenges are in particular spheres. No knee-jerk, oh my God, world is becoming protectionist, we are going to become more self-reliant.
Well,
If I can add just one thing, like to Arvind's, he talked about quality control orders, and there's the new World Bank's World to Development report is about standards and development, and it's about the need for higher quality. But the mistake India has done is put the quality control orders on inputs, intermediate goods. Usually, quality control orders you should have is on the final goods, just on the product. How the manufacturer, where he sources, how he sources is not as relevant. But it is, I think, pretty clear the quality control orders have an element of rent seeking. Big firms are using it as a protectionist device, just like almost a substitute for tariffs. And once again, the cost is being borne by the sector that has the highest employment elasticity, which is small and medium enterprises.
No, in fact, sorry, just see to me, Rajdeep, this imposition of quality control orders, which was done under the garb of we need to react to China, we need to react to protectionism. So it's very easy to use that as an excuse to do rent seeking domestically, to favor some groups. So that's why we have to be careful about how you interpret changing geopolitics. It should not become an excuse or a cover for pursuing inappropriate policies domestically.
Well, Rajdeep, I have one final
Yeah, go
question,
ahead.
but before that, just for the context of our viewers, this quality control orders is very, very significant. Between 2016 till recently, close to 700 quality control orders were issued. So internationally, they are described as barriers to trade. So you basically raise the bar on quality control, and therefore products cannot come in, finished products cannot come in. And what the two doctors here have said, just to add, that roughly 12% of these have already been withdrawn. A review is underway for others. And if you add that to the number of trade deals that we are negotiating, and we are not even talking about what may happen with the United States, I think there is more than a recalibration of our trade strategy, both from an export as well as from trade openness. Is this going to be enough? What will happen to our exports in the near term? These are questions for a news show maybe, but I had one question, if you allow me. Since we spoke about transformation, I just want to, in the reference to the book and our Odyssey really, what is that one reform that both of you could pick up that is required as one move that New Delhi should make? What would that one reform be? To both of you, that question.
So I think, as you might remember in the book, Siddharth, we say we are not going to get into this laundry list. We have just one recommendation: do no harm. Take the Hippocratic oath. Arvind, of course, will have somewhat different views. I believe a country must trust its own people. All these controls, all of these many things you have, trust your own people, empower them, and they will deliver. But instead, we have such a strong control mentality that we believe only Sarkar knows best. Everyone else has to be managed. And in that process, there's a lot of harm done.
So
just to go ahead, Arvind.
No, but yeah. So we will absolutely, studiously, steadfastly refuse to answer the question of give me 1, 2, 3. See, not because we are obstinate or a thing, but if you look at India's own history, you see much of the big change has come about because of crises, technology, or due to inaction. So I think we're not doing it because there's some. But I just want to build on this principle of do no harm. We say that in a very specific sense, actually. Because if you look back over the sweep of 75 years, what we see is that some of our early successes were, democracy, nation building, preserving order, good relations between the center and the states, a general sense of harmony, right? Which through all the vicissitudes and ups and downs, created the conditions for India to achieve even as much as we achieved. We made some mistakes, we remedied them on the economy and so on. But the danger today is some of those early successes of institutions, democracy, pluralism, sense of nationhood, good, harmonious, cooperative federalism, those are under threat of being undermined. So when we say do no harm, it's that do no harm to the successes that we've already achieved. And that's what we mean by do no harm. Maybe actually it's more demanding than do 1, 2, 3. But I think that's where I think we would strongly believe that that's what we should avoid.
I think that's a fine note on which we can conclude. We could keep talking about this book. As I said, it's a monumental work, and congratulations to both of you for having put it out over these 5 years. It's not a 5-year plan, fortunately. It's just 5 years that you took to write a book. There's a sentence that I want to leave our audiences with. The Indian Transformation Society is one of prolonged ruralization, premature industrialization, and precocious servication. So there are lots of such lines, and I think with all the data that you've muscled in, you've given us a very, very objective view. What I liked about the book is that it's not an ideological project that you embarked on. You actually embarked on what perhaps maybe Siddharth and fellow journalists should do one day, who track the economy and tell us what they've seen for themselves. But given both your experiences, you brought it to this book. It has been, in that sense, a perfect jugalbandi, and I'm sure for Siddharth and me, it's been an education to read this book. And thank you very much for addressing, in a way, the concerns of a sixth of humanity, as you appropriately put it. Dr. Subramanian, Dr. Kapur, for joining us here on book. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we wish you all success with the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Siddharth and Rajdeep, for having us. So thanks a lot. A lot of fun.
My pleasure.